Hi, everyone. This is the Canadian Foreign Policy Hour. I hope everyone is doing well. I'm coming to you from Jojage, which has long been a meeting place of various First Nations, otherwise known as Montreal. So to start off with, the National Post has continued with its very embarrassing 6-month-long celebration of Israel's 75. And the Saturday paper was a front page all about Israel. And then they had 2 full pages inside devoted to Israel. And then they had a big commentary devoted to Israel and another commentary devoted to Israel. It's really quite an embarrassing comment on Canadian political culture that the paper has been doing this for months and months of these front page celebrations of the apartheid state. On May 22nd, there's going to be a walk with Israel in Toronto. So if anyone's in Toronto, I know there's some form of counter protest that is going to be taking place. So I invite people to, if you go out to that. The NDP on the Palestinian question, the NDP put out a statement a few days ago. That's pretty good considering things. It reiterated what the members called for, which was banning settlement products, banning arms sales, and a couple of other points that they Heather McPherson put out. So that was a pretty good statement. There's a good article in the Maple headlined, "Here's what Canada's leading pro-Israel group says about Netanyahu's far-right government." And the CIJA, the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, which is the lobby organization of the Jewish federations in Canada, its person on the ground that heads up its office in Israel is a real fanatic, a real hardline anti-Palestinian. And the article goes through a lot of what he has said. And today, Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East put out a comment or a press release as regarding the basically calling on CIJA to distance itself from its representative in Israel, to condemn some of his viciously anti-Palestinian pro-settlement expansion comments. So I invite people to check out that article on the Maple, and also CJPME's sort of running with the information that was published in that article to try to put pressure on CIJA. CJPME put out another press release a couple days earlier where they talked about this website called the J.ca. And it's just like this viciously anti-Palestinian website, openly racist. And they published one of the articles on the site is titled "Jewish Lives Matter. Jewish lives not only matter, but they matter more." And the fact there's a site out there like that, whatever. But what CJPME goes after is that Pierre Poilievre, Rob Oliphant, and a whole bunch of conservative, Rob Oliphant being a Liberal MP, they're all advertising on this website. And so the CJPM is calling on them to explicitly distance themselves from this racist website. In other news, Han Dong, the Liberal MP that was accused of being trying to keep the two Michaels imprisoned in China as part of this Chinese interference brouhaha that's been going on for a few months. He launched a lawsuit against Global News for $15 million. And as I tweeted on Matthew Green, the NDP MP, that was basically sort of supporting Han Dong in his lawsuit, in his tweet, Jagmeet Singh, the NDP leader, called for Han Dong to be removed from the Liberal caucus just on this really spurious accusation from CSIS, which has a long history of lying, quite frankly, and of dubious politically motivated allegations. So we'll see where that case goes. With regards to Peru, the coup in Peru hasn't received much attention in recent weeks. Actually, today in Le Devoir paper, there was an op-ed talking about the repression in Peru, decent op-ed. Ben Norton on Twitter reported on a opinion poll from this establishment Peruvian polling firm that found that this Congress that helped oust the elected president back in December, that it has a 6% approval with 91% disapproval, and that the U.S. and Canadian-backed president, de facto president Dina Boluarte, has just a 15% approval with 78% disapproval. And let's not forget that part of how they justified ousting Castillo was that he had a low popularity, low approval rating, but his approval rating was far, far higher than what we're seeing now with Boluarte and, of course, the Congress. So the sort of undemocratic, the coup nature of what took place is just becoming more and more evident by the day, and yet the Canadian government has not shifted gears. Yesterday, I believe, maybe it was the day before, it was Lester Pearson, would have been Lester Pearson's birthday, born in 1897. And a number of Twitter accounts with great diplomat, Lester Pearson, who of course was prominent external affairs official, then became external affairs minister, and then later became prime minister, went up through the ranks of external affairs. I have a book called Lester Pearson's Peacekeeping, The Truth May Hurt. And Bob Ray tweeted about the great Lester Pearson and his important role at the UN and whatnot yesterday. And I tweeted in response, well, Lester Pearson supported the US war in Vietnam very aggressively. Not only did he support it rhetorically, he had, and this was uncovered in the Pentagon Papers, he had Canadians through the International Control Commission supposed to bring about a peaceful settlement, had them spy on North Vietnam, had them deliver US bombing threats to the North Vietnamese, saying, hey, if you don't do this, we will bomb you. We being, of course, Washington. Then the US, of course, did bomb North Vietnam, killed 100,000 people in that clear violation of international law. And that's why Noam Chomsky considers Pearson a war criminal. But beyond Vietnam, you have him backing the US-led coups against Arbenz in Guatemala, Mossade in Iran, Juan Bosch in Dominican, Canada backing the American invasion there in '65, against Goulart in Brazil. You have him justifying basically Nelson Mandela's imprisonment. He has a terrible track record on Palestine, and I'm not going to get into that in any sort of detail because that's very extensive. He threatened to resign as external minister if Canada didn't send ground troops to Korea to fight in that war that left 3 million dead, that was precipitated in part by justifying NATO expansion in Europe. That's a whole interesting question of how that was used to justify NATO expansion, North American troops in Europe, but it was partly in response to the Chinese Revolution in 1949, Mao's forces winning in 1949, and the Korean War was just partly about priming the economy after the end of World War II, reduction in military spending, economic downturn. This was a way to justify massive military spending to stabilize North American capitalism with its booms and busts. So this idea of Lester Pearson as this like peacekeeping, diplomat is just complete and utter nonsense that really should be rejected. Yesterday, the Canadian press published a story titled "South African Envoy Urges Ukraine Peace Talks, says Canada's stance on war shocking." So it's basically the High Commissioner, South African High Commissioner in Ottawa, criticizing Canadian policy on Ukraine. Now, despite the headline, his actual wording was a bit more softer than that, but nevertheless very clear from a diplomatic standpoint, an intervention to push back against Canadian policy on more and more war, more and more NATO, more and more no talk about negotiations, etc. Brazilian President Lula doubled down. He's in Europe, doubling down on his comments about needing to stop fueling the war in Ukraine. He pointed out, he said, quote, "How can we achieve peace between Russia and Ukraine if no one is talking about peace?" I think a very sensible comment, hard to argue with. Now, to see the reaction of the ideological enforcers or the NATO stenographers in Canada to the South African envoy's interview with Canadian press is quite telling. Andrew Coyne, the CBC and Globe and Mail prominent commentator, he said, "Why is this even news?" Right? So there's been like hundreds of articles. Canadian press has probably published hundreds, certainly dozens of interviews with US, British, Polish, Ukrainian, Latvian, whatever officials on what's going on in Ukraine. And he's saying it's not news. It's how dare Canadian press interview the South African official. Kyle Matthews, this guy who's close to Erwin Kotler and the genocide studies program at Concordia, he came out and he just basically said he's supporting the aggressor, the violation of the UN Charter, even though absolutely clear cut in the interview, the South African representative says we consider this a violation of international law. Despite that, he's accused of siding with Russia and in violation of the UN Charter, which just goes to how any dissent from the official line is just branded Russian puppet, Russian propaganda. And one of the dynamics developing that my father today was pointing out, and I think is correct, early on in the war, Russian invasion, there was all kinds of people on the left who were equating it to Algeria, Vietnam, and anti-colonial struggles. Okay, and that the Peace Quest actually a couple of weeks ago sent out to their email to their list. Peace Quest did the same thing. Well, the reality is that the countries that have been under the boot of colonialism are the ones who are explicitly denying that, right? From South Africa to Brazil, even the South Koreans are not very, very reticent about sending weapons. So in fact, it's the colonial world, the colonized world, that are ones explicitly rejecting this idea that was pushed by a lot of people on the left, and still to some extent in recent days. As part of this, these NATO stenographers accusing everyone of being Russian propagandists if they dissent from the official line. I, of course, had my recent event last week at the Centre Saint-Pierre with a couple other people. They canceled the room booking. The World Socialist website published an article titled "Far-Right Ukrainian Nationalists Force Cancellation of Montreal Anti-War Meeting. This brazen act of censorship must not go unchallenged," which actually interviews the guy at the Centre Saint-Pierre. It's worth checking out. In the Kingston Whig Standard a couple of days ago, in an article titled "Russia Uses Twitter to Attack Democracy," the author throws out the idea that Twitter potentially should be banned. Okay, so Twitter in Canada should be banned because it's a pro-Russia media platform, and they quote Chris Alexander, who was a minister in the Harper government. I believe he was a Canadian, might have been Canadian ambassador to Ukraine or ambassador to Russia, basically saying that, well, if we're not going to ban Twitter, we should at least start using our CRTC rules about hate speech and equating it to RT, and we've banned RT on the CRTC's banned RT, so maybe we can figure out what we can do on that front. So this is where it's all going, right? They're in their desire for 100% control of the narrative. I mean, they have 99, 98, what is it, percent of the narrative. In their desire to have the whole thing, they're going all out, talking about banning stuff. Now, the biggest development in probably Canadian foreign policy this week was the Washington Post on the front page revealing that on Thursday, maybe Wednesday, Thursday, revealing that Trudeau had apparently said, as part of the leak of these documents, that U.S. documents, that Trudeau had apparently said that Canada's not going to get the 2% of GDP military spending, is not going to hit the 2% mark. It's around 1.3 right now. And this Washington Post article was just basically all about how the Americans are unhappy, and other NATO and other countries, that Canada is just not belligerent, imperialistic enough. They quote apparently the Haitian government is complaining about Canada not sending a military mission there. That Haitian government, of course, is what, right? I mean, it's a joke. The Haitian government was appointed, as I mentioned many a times before, was appointed by the U.S. Canada-led core group through a tweet. But apparently the Haitians are, angry at Canada for not being more imperialistic. I think it's the Turkish government complaining, that put something about Canada, and mostly it's about the U.S. Now, this got tons, front page, Globe Mail put on the front page on the weekend, tons and tons of attention, all the different commentators, taking this all as a really, how dare Trudeau make this comment. And I thought that I would start off with this question. Actually, our guest tonight, we're very lucky to have Scott Taylor, who's a award-winning Canadian journalist, war reporter, documentary filmmaker, author of books, the editor of Esprit du Corps magazine, which is focuses on military affairs, a magazine that the military back in the 90s on a number of occasions worked to try to shut down. And we have Scott with us this evening to discuss Canadian foreign policy, military affairs. And so first of all, thanks a lot for coming on, Scott. And I guess that my first question is this whole 2% discussion. I mean, it's a really arbitrary number. Your piece today, I just saw a couple hours ago, delves into it. You point out a couple things. I think a really important one about China's military spending per GDP is about the same as Canada's, around 1.3%. So this big Chinese boogeyman that we have to, militarize to target against is only spending basically what Canada is spending, which is much less than what the US and, other countries are spending. And then there's, I know I've seen different analyses of, if you add the Coast Guard into it, in some countries add the Coast Guard. And then if you just start, one way you can hit 2% is just by giving a really good, pay raise to those in uniform. I think there's all kinds of all kinds of other creative ways. So what do you think of this whole discussion of the 2% number?
Well, when you look at the disparity in the GDPs of the NATO members, I mean, we're the sixth largest spender of the 31 members of the alliance, because we have a huge GDP, whereas you've got some countries that they're going to balloon to a 4% of their GDP because they purchased something like 6 used F-16s in one fiscal year. They've got, these are cash-strapped countries that are spending the 2%, but it's not giving them very much in terms of actual hardware because of their tiny GDPs. Countries like Latvia and Estonia, they're well over the 2%, but again, they're being bailed out by European Union countries and NATO countries by being based in their country. So a lot of this is unseen money that's being spent. And again, as you said, if you take in the care for wounded soldiers and you put the RCMP, call them a gendarmerie, and then call the Coast Guard out, you can balloon CBSA, put them all as part of Canada's security forces and hand it in and just whatever it takes to get to 2% and say, there you go, without adding a single bayonet or a single aircraft. It's just such a meaningless number to pick. And as you pointed out, I pointed out, the Chinese spend, they would be shirkers according to NATO to the same degree that Canada is, yet they're portrayed by the Colonel Blimp Brigade as being some sort of warmongering, military behemoth. And they're somehow able to do it on the same percentage that we're spending, and we're not pulling our weight. So, and again, how they get away with it now, after we've seen over a year of the Russian military machine not being the invincible force that they told us it was going to be. That was supposed to be over in a matter of weeks. And the Russians were going to, it wasn't about how long is it going to take before they secure Ukraine. It was which countries are next. Everybody was looking at Latvia, they're looking at Moldova. It's like, where is he going to go next? He's going to conquer the world. He couldn't get to Kiev, and now he's been in a war of attrition and just in the Donbass region for over a year, unable to subdue the Ukrainian army. So where is the fear for the other 31 NATO countries that he's going to somehow do more after a year of being diminished and unable to even deal with a non-NATO country like Ukraine? It's just the fact that they can still manage to generate that fear, and of course then switch the focus to China. How many times do they cry wolf and the wolf turns out to be a pussycat?
And you published actually what initially made me think about inviting you on. Well, I had people been asking to have you on for a little while now, but what maybe crystallized it was a piece you published, I guess it's a week ago now, titled "Trudeau's Statement on War is Dumb." And this was based upon a journalist asking, which I found this interesting, a journalist asking Trudeau if Canada, quote, state publicly to Canadians that Canada is now in a proxy war with Russia. Journalists asked a yes or no answer to Trudeau on this. And Trudeau's response was, quote, Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine upended 80 years of peace, stability, and security around the world. One of the most prosperous eras in the world has ever known. We have all benefited from that immeasurably everywhere around the world. Russia's decision to end that peace, to violate the UN Charter, to overturn international law, to arbitrarily choose to redraw lines on a map is, of course, of deep concern to Canada. Now, you've reported on the ground from a number of wars that makes this kind of a hard one to believe.
Too many. And the fact that, the Canadian military have been either involved in many of those wars or have been deployed to keep the peace after those wars, it's just such a ridiculous statement. It's as if the world, that we've all somehow missed that the world's been at peace for the last 80 years until Putin just suddenly, out of the blue, decided to invade. Anybody who follows this particular conflict knows that it erupted into armed violence back in 2014. This wasn't something that sparked on February 2022 by Putin invading. It was already an ongoing conflict. And the fact that it was a regional conflict, it was a low level, if you will, civil war in a sense for the people of the Donbass, the mostly ethnic Russian or Russian speaking people of the Donbass, who took up arms against the new Kiev regime after the Maidan. And Canada's been training Ukrainian troops. Like, what have we been doing there if not participating and giving arms and training and money to this conflict that was already there? Putin simply escalated it into an interstate war from what was a civil war that we were already sending in troops, money, and weaponry. So to come out and say that 80 years of peace was shattered, you can exaggerate sometimes, but to make something so ridiculously, so verifiably proven wrong is just ridiculous.
Did anyone else report on it besides you?
I don't think so. I had to watch it twice just because he didn't just say what I think he said. I thought maybe he'd couched it and say, changing the lines of, even if he said changing the lines of Europe, as I said in the column, I was stationed in West Germany. It's now Germany. It's been reunified. Czechoslovakia has become Czechia and Slovakia. The Balkans is now 7 different countries from Yugoslavia, what it was. And one of those states, Kosovo, it was ripped apart for its Serbian sovereign territory, and it was taken. And then they did a unilateral declaration of independence in 2007 after the 1999 bombing, which, if you look at it from pull back and you say, what the rationale we used as NATO to intervene in Kosovo was a disenfranchised minority with a different language wanted to separate from Serbia, and we went in and bombed the Serbians until that happened. It would be as if we took the side of the people in the Donbass in this instance, only it's actually it would have been anyway. It's for the same reasons that they want to express themselves and have their own culture. If most people in Quebec realized what this was about, I think there'd be a huge swelling of support, if not sympathy, for the people of the Donbass region, who are also, we stand with Ukraine, but it's also part of Ukraine according to our own doctrine, which sees it as a unified part, and it's inseparable. What's going to happen, and I've written about this as well, if indeed they manage to push the last Russian soldier from the occupied territory now, the whole Donbass region, which has been separate and an armed enclave since 2014, because that's the will of the people that are living there now. If they do manage to put Ukrainian soldiers back on that ground, they're going to be facing a hostile occupation, or, as some of the Ukrainian generals have pointed out, those people living there that have lived there for hundreds of years will be welcome to leave with the last of the Russian soldiers. So we're talking a not even a veiled threat of massive ethnic cleansing, and that's the people that we're providing with the weaponry and the training and everything else. But I'm not hearing anybody coming out and saying, look, that's not going to happen. I mean, we're not going to allow that to happen. We're siding with them, and it's right now, anybody who questions, like you were saying earlier, the narrative that all Ukraine belongs to Ukrainians and they got to get the last of the Russian soldiers off. Well, what about the Russian and ethnic Russian and Russian speaking Ukrainians who side with the Russians and have sided with them openly since 2014?
And what do you make of the South African High Commissioner's comment in terms of criticizing Canadian policy?
Well, I mean, this reminds me of what happened in 2010 when the South Africans had actually came very close to brokering a deal in Libya. There was going to be a partition of Libya in which Gaddafi would be allowed to keep the western portion, and then the people in Benghazi would keep the part of the east. And at the time, our foreign minister, John Baird, flew into Benghazi, and was a rather spectacular trip. He flew in and he told the rebels, that deal is off. You're going to get everything. Keep fighting. Take this peace deal off the table. And I had a very good relationship at the time with the South African envoy. And again, they couldn't believe that Canada would have gone in and done this when a sort of negotiated deal was at hand. And if you look at the events that have happened since we bombed Gaddafi out of existence, the anarchy that prevails there to this day has made that a failed state. So it wasn't like we succeeded or we gave the people of Libya of freedom or any sort of better future. We destroyed the country. We won't get into all the details about the oil and the gold, but it's Canada that took the lead role. It was our general that led the attack, that led the NATO force. And we are the only country that staged a victory parade after that war was over on Parliament Hill. We spent over, they say 800,000, was probably much more. We had a fly past, we had a march past, we had the guys all got medals. It's just one of those things where for Canada to be proud of the fact that we crushed Libya. I was there reporting on that war. I was in the Gaddafi controlled zone, and I had been in Belgrade during the 99 bombing as well there. And at least the Serbs had air defense. They had air raid warnings. They had sirens would go off. Air raid defenses would put up a barrage. The Libyans had nothing. They just got bombed. Like there was no sirens, there was no anti-aircraft fire. You would just see explosions because NATO operated for 10 months, 11 months, the so-called no-fly zone. They just operated with complete impunity. The Libyan Air Force never took off. We never took a single casualty. How you could even call that a war? We just beat up on a third world country and for 10 months and killed the leader. And somehow the Stephen Harper government of the day thought that was worth celebrating. It was distasteful.
And you reported that the flag colors of the Canadian Special Forces Command were flown during that celebration, I believe, if I remember correctly.
They marched in the parade, which means that they were most likely on the ground because it's or training at the very least somewhere nearby, but most likely they were on the ground.
And which would have been a clear, explicit violation of the UN resolutions, the 1973 and 1970 UN resolutions, okaying the fly zone. The other thing.
The British and the French definitely had special forces there, and there's videos. I mean, there's documentaries showing them as they arrived with the arming the rebels coming out and all this stuff. So it wasn't that big. It was sort of a tongue-in-cheek secret that they were there or that they were doing what they were doing. So, but we were the only ones of all the NATO countries that participated and the non-NATO countries that we actually staged a victory parade. And you look back on how brutally those Libyan rebels murdered Gaddafi in the street. I mean, they sodomized him with a tent peg and he bled out. I mean, this is, and then we're going to celebrate that execution of a world leader. Like it's unbelievable.
Yeah, the other thing you mentioned, the South Africans in the negotiations, the African Union. This was something I didn't until I researched my Canada and Africa book. The African Union worked hard at multiple stages to try to curtail the fighting and to avoid NATO bombing and NATO campaign and all that stuff. And the Canadian government was pushing this whole African solutions for African problems for years before, talking about this. And then when there was a genuine, multiple leaders of African countries tried to fly in and really put a lot of diplomatic energy. And then, of course, Canada and the U.S. just could care less about African solutions to African problems. Now, so any comments about Ukraine today? Any sort of, I mean, there's been reports about Canadian special forces on the ground. Any, broader sense of Canada's role that may be, underreported?
Well, I think, I mean, the focus on this whole thing being a proxy war, I mean, this is NATO using our weaponry, our training, and I mean, most likely our experts in special forces. I mean, we're handing over our armor now to them to try to build for this big spring offensive to crush the Russians. It's like for people to mock that and say that's not the case, and that's not the narrative. The narrative is this is just poor Ukraine. They've been attacked by the Russians, and we got to do what we can to defend our values. And sometimes I question that because things like the clamping down on the freedom of the press, even my colleague David Pugliese, they've labeled him an undesirable person, the Ukrainian government. This is for his past writings about the neo-Nazis and some of it even just the glorification of the Nazis, that Stepan Bandera was a Nazi collaborator, and they've got streets named after him. They have January 1st, they celebrate his birthday, it's an official holiday. And it's like, well, where are we going with this? This is like, if they are in need of Canadian expertise, in need of Canadian money, in need of Canadian weaponry, that should put us in the driver's seat to say, look, no more Nazi glorification. You guys got to cut back on that. But right now, it's the people like David Pugliese or myself, I'm sure. I mean, if we mention these things, we're the ones that are ostracized. And that's where it's, pointing out the evils of Hitler's regime and the Nazi collaborators, the fact that and we just celebrated them as a Holocaust Day. I mean, it's amazing that we've come this far, that this Nazi glorification is one of the things which needs to be. I'm not saying that every one of their soldiers is a Nazi, not by any stretch of the imagination, but if it exists and the people now that are able to curtail freedom of the press and expressing these things, that's not a good sign, and that's not certainly Canadian values, which these amenities and these trainers and everything that we're giving them should come with a price tag, and that being that there's got to be some reform, particularly in terms of the corruption of the Ukrainian government. At the start of the war, they were the most corrupt government in Europe. Why would that change just because we're dumping weaponry and money into the country when they're in a state of war? Unlikely. I mean, people from the EU have expressed concerns to me that this is something, the reason that there's been no speedy entry of Ukraine into the EU is because, frankly, they've had a look at the books, and there's no way that the EU can shoulder that kind of debt load moving forward with that level of corruption. So everybody wants to be on and standing with Ukraine, but the minute you scratch the surface and you realize that Ukraine is not itself unified, then it's like, which side of Ukraine do we stand with? Putin chose his side, so that means obviously, but we chose our side back in 2014, 2015.
And you mentioned, you touched on the media, and I should point out for people who may have not seen this, the Kyiv Independent, which was a media publication set up about a year and a half ago with $200,000 in seed money from the Canadian government, published this story about 2-3 weeks ago, all targeting David Pugliese, who's probably the most prominent military reporter in the country, been at the Ottawa Citizen for like more than 3 decades, and called him an undesirable, and then actually quoted a anonymous Canadian official, mostly they're quoting Ukrainian officials, but also quoted an anonymous Canadian official, kind of echoing this type of rhetoric. And I didn't see anybody. A few of these sort of military types tweeted it out and kind of gloated about it, but there was really almost no kind of reaction, no sort of like pushback to it. But this goes to that kind of broader question. I mean, you've written about lots about the military's embedding program and how the military controls the message, the Canadian military I'm talking about here, during different wars historically. Is it, am I correct to say that this is sort of the level of one-sided narrative, the propaganda, if you like, is particularly, at its maybe highest point in recent sort of memory?
Well, certainly for a war that we're not actually involved in. I mean, we are as much as we possibly could be. We've given them our assault rifles, we've given them our Carl Gustavs, we've given them training, we've given them money, the Ukrainians, everything but sending in our soldiers to fight alongside of them. But I mean, when we go back just to Afghanistan, and you had mentioned earlier that individual Chris Alexander, who was the first ambassador to Afghanistan, and he'd been an envoy in, I believe, the embassy in Moscow. He hasn't met a war he doesn't want to sell. I mean, he was huge on that. He was one of the biggest reasons why so many Canadian soldiers got killed unnecessarily, because we should never have remained. That whole thing about the Afghanistan papers that come out in the Washington Post, where the Americans knew early on that that war was unwinnable, but they continued to sell it to the Canadian and American public. He was a major conduit of that. I mean, that's he kept on pushing it. He got a job at the UN after he was the ambassador. He stayed in Kabul. And any reporter, any one of these, what do you call them, note takers or whatever, the NATO cheerleaders that comes over there, they would go to his office, and he was always, they were one schoolhouse away from victory. We just, we got to stick it out. It's a marathon. The people love us, et cetera, et cetera. No, he sold a bill of goods, and he sold it well. But I mean, to the detriment of the Canadian military, who continued on. I mean, they would have realized early on that the war was unwinnable, but people like Chris Alexander kept telling the Canadian public that it was, or that it was already won, when it certainly wasn't. So there's where you get the people there. It's people in government that are selling this to the eager journalists who are taking it down, and no one wants to swim upstream on this. Nobody wants to report any of the failings. Like even President Zelensky, very charismatic, popular guy around the world right now, but he has been firing some of his key cabinet ministers for corruption. He's been firing people, barely gets a ripple. But if he's realizing that he's got problems at that level in the middle of a war, we should find it as well that we could support him better by actually reporting that and helping him to expose any of these people who are corrupt in his own regime.
So I'll open it up to questions, and go Laura.
So Eve, you've got Joan and Hans and then myself.
Go ahead, Joan.
Oh, I was wondering if you'd comment on what was revealed, I think it was a couple of days ago, about the whole scam and with Hunter Biden, and how the CIA was behind that to try to facilitate the election of Biden. And I was amazed when I heard that. I know there were always questions when in the last, certainly raised by Trump in the last election, and it was always denied. But it ends up that the CIA said, well, you're probably familiar with the article, but it seems as though the CIA was told to do was to say that it was a Russian scam, and in fact it wasn't. It was found to be something that was generated by the U.S. government. And I want to say just one other thing that about Libya. I can remember how Bush came out and said he's killing his people. It's terrible. He's killing his people. Of course, that's so different from what the U.S. does, go in and kill other states' people. I always remember him saying that, and I thought that was ridiculous.
Well, I agree on that point, because anytime someone takes up weapons against somebody and then he's quote unquote killing his own people, well, they're trying to kill him. I mean, that was what was happening with the Gaddafi in the civil war there. I'm not up to speed entirely on the Biden CIA connection, but what is, what I've seen is how once narratives are taken on, the entire U.S. media will ignore certain subjects, which Seymour Hersh just came out recently with a detailed account of who bombed the Nord Stream oil pipeline, and it was the Americans, and they detailed how they did it, when they did it, why they did it. And that's something which is technically an act of war that America perpetrated against a NATO ally, against Germany, by blowing up their key infrastructure. And it was dismissed and ignored. Like, I kept turning on like late night TV shows, expecting it's going to be something major that's going to blow up, because this is huge that America would have done this to an ally. And then they blamed, of course, they said the Russians did it, when why would the Russians, when they control a pipeline, blow it up if all they have to do is turn it off? So there's an amazing, like, and I'm sure in other countries, but I'm sure in the Russian media, that Seymour Hersh, the respected journalist that he is, and the sources that he has, I mean, he detailed the whole thing, and it got dismissed as hearsay or innuendo, which was a major story. But they were able to just completely gloss it over and bury it, and then focus on what they wanted to focus on. So it's tough when you're working in this game, because it's things that should blow up on, and that they don't. Very few people picked up on Trudeau's comments about 80 years of peace. I mean, that's just insane, especially when I've covered those wars. I've seen it. I mean, we've been part of it. How can he not know that?
And I should say, with the Seymour Hersh thing, Facebook has been essentially banning that article.
Yes.
So they've been putting this like marker on it. If you share that article on your Facebook page, saying that this is like not a reliable thing, and it sends you to this Norwegian fact-checking thing that basically challenges what Seymour Hersh has reported on. And he was on antiwar.com, that Branko, I forget his last name, who's a staff writer at Jacobin, has a long piece going through this and showing all these other articles that say that Russia was responsible for blowing up Nord Stream, that those don't get flagged by Facebook. And in fact, the people who post it get a message saying you're posting something that's disinformation, and that your reach to the public is going to be throttled if you keep posting this disinformation. So that's how far, not only do they not, the dominant media basically ignore Hersh's pretty serious investigation, they got to the point where even Facebook is seeking to basically throttle it or suppress it. Go ahead, Hans. Sorry, I think you have to unmute. I think I just hit it.
I was going to say this is a palpably good session. Thank you, Scott, and of course, Eve. I have a two-pronged question. Was it not around the time of the Libyan invasion that the West tried to disguise this with the doctrine, the responsibility to protect minorities, or something to that effect?
There was the same excuse they used.
That's the first part of my question. Now, in the meantime, I've come across the writings of a Swiss intelligence officer named Jacques Baud, B-A-U-D, who observed that on February 16, 2022, 8 days before the Russian invasion, the Ukrainian side initiated a horrendous bombardment of Donetsk and built up a contingent reportedly of 100,000 troops, including paramilitaries. In other words, this was 8 days before the Russian launch, and signified a willingness of the Ukrainian regime to settle accounts with the dissident minority republics of Donetsk and Luhansk. The Russians, I believe, tried to invoke the same doctrine, responsibility to protect, by justifying their invasion as an intervention to protect precisely those Russophone minorities. Now, you did mention the analogy with Quebec. And the fact that the UN Charter at its founding never incorporated the rights of minority nations, such as Quebec, and you might add Chechnya in the Soviet world. The right of these nations, and the Kurdish nation is the most conspicuous one, the right of those minority internal nations to determine their own future. So I'm sorry about the lengthy question, but it divides into this totally heretical in the media view that Putin really had no choice but to defend his minorities, especially after this massive troop buildup over the winter of 2022.
So you were right. I mean, the right to protect was something that they invoked in order to bomb Kosovo in '99. That was the Albanian majority. They said was under threat. But they've also had the policy in '95 where Croatia expulsed all the Serbs from the Krajina in Operation Storm. That was they said that the sovereignty, the integrity of the sovereignty of the country was more important than whatever, and the Croats just simply cleansed them all out. So we've seen attempts to do that as well at Georgia when they went in 2008 into Ossetia, South Ossetia. The Russians came back and showed that they would protect the minorities there. They did intervene. I covered that war as well. Very much misunderstood again that Russia invaded Georgia. Russia did not. There's a language and a culture and people called Ossetians. They had broke away from Georgia back in, I guess, 1994, 91. And there had been a frozen conflict there and still remains a frozen conflict. A neighboring region of Abkhazia, they have their own language, Abkhazian, and that's again protected by the Russians for the same right to protect that you're talking about, which it's only if we pick it, if it's us choosing the right to protect, then we say that it's got some merit. If it's the Russians that say this, it's got no merit whatsoever. He's violating sovereignty and integrity of a nation. So it's the hypocrisy at its highest, and that's why people whitewashing and simply saying that we've had peace for 80 years and now we're going to see something different. We have violated all those same rules. We bombed and invaded Iraq with the Americans, or the Americans did, on a trumped up weapons of mass destruction excuse. It's basically whatever lie you wish to tell. If we're there to protect people, we put the NATO Air Force in an umbrella above Libya as the right to protect, so that we a no-fly zone, so that Gaddafi couldn't use his superior weaponry to suppress his rebels. Our generals, the Canadian generals and the NATO generals, immediately took that to mean it was a no-drive zone for the Libyan army. They started bombing the crap out of them. So we were there to protect Libyans from being bombed, and then we started bombing the Libyans we didn't like without any kind of mandate. That was not a proper UN mandate. We violated it completely.
Yeah,
Gregory and Frank, oh, sorry, go ahead.
yeah. So I wouldn't characterize it as Russia had no option, right? I've said that before. I think that NATO is the geopolitical aggressor, but I think that it's a mistake to characterize. There were alternatives that the Russian leadership could have pursued rather than that. And I also think that my sense, and I'm not a military expert on this, but my sense is that the Ukrainians amassing large numbers of troops probably was part of a longer term project of really, reconquering all of the Donbass, but it also was a reaction to the fact that there had been 100,000 plus Russian troops since December, right, and building up on the border. So I think the idea that Ukraine was just on the cusp of reconquering all the Donbass, and so therefore it was like sort of in defensive like that, I think that's a little bit of a exaggerated.
Well, but the fact I'm pointing out, according to Jacques Baud, this bombardment of Donetsk started on February 16th, 8 days before the invasion. That is a significant fact.
And people don't realize, but the ones that were being shelled, I mean, they are also Ukrainian citizens, albeit they chose to separate. But according to Canadian doctrine, they are as well, at the time, Ukrainian citizens, which we say we stand with them, but we only stand with one side. But again, it's people talk about the size of the Russian military, and they look at it in its entirety, and then they say it should have crushed Ukraine, but the people all talked about the 120,000 Russian troops massed on the border. But a huge amount of its combat force, that's what it constituted. But the Ukrainian force has been being trained by NATO and Canadians as well since 2015. And they had a bit of experience fighting in the frozen conflict around the Donbass. So these guys were well seasoned and well equipped. And in the early stages in the propaganda war, when the Russians came in and everybody was fleeing and all stuff, there was a tremendous amount of CBC coverage where they were showing people all making Molotov cocktails, filling their trucks with Molotov cocktails. They're all going to resist Russian tanks with Molotov cocktails. I've never seen a single incident where they actually used a Molotov cocktail or got close enough. They didn't have to. They had these sophisticated American Javelin rockets that they could take them out from 1 or 2 kilometers away, far superior to what the Russians had. But the whole myth of David versus Goliath, I think people forgot who won that fight, because he didn't have a rock. In this case, he had a Javelin missile. So, and they've been being trained on them for years. So this was a largely, I think, baited trap for the Russian bear, and whatever intelligence that Putin was getting from his generals was completely faulty. And it turns out his army was far more corrupt than he knew, and it didn't take long to expose that corruption. They may have. I mean, now that they've actually had to engage in combat and things have gotten very real, and they've had a year to sort things out, they may be better now than they were when they first went in.
So you've got Gregory, Frank, and Francisco.
Did you want to ask something, Laura?
No, go straight to Gregory.
Okay, go ahead, Greg.
Oh, hi, yes, Yves, thank you, and Scott, thank you for your insights. Yeah, just I know this. Like, I agree with you, Yves. Hopefully, Putin would have been had he used other options rather than military option. I mean, but I think Tina posted that you know, the world had not been listening to Putin. He'd been requesting negotiation, the Minsk 1, Minsk 2, to de-escalate this conflict, and he's been treated with nothing but contempt by Western leaders. Nothing but contempt, as have the Russian people. Now, that said, we're hearing in the West all kinds of stories about just how inept and incompetent the Russian military is. And according to Scott Ritter and Colonel Douglas Macgregor, this is not the case. They're proceeding slowly and steadily, degrading the Ukrainian forces that have been armed by NATO. They're learning, and they are in the process of, and again, they have suffered large losses, but nothing compared to what the Ukrainians have lost. And that, according to McGregor and Ritter, by the end of summer, early fall, late fall, this will be over. That no matter what NATO does, the Russians are going to, you know, defeat this force and win this proxy war. And when I listen to them in the face of what I hear in the West, they seem to have a lot more credibility. The total denigration of the Russian military just seems to be, you know, a lot of hot air here, to be honest. And McGregor and Ritter are military men with a lot of credibility. So where do you stand on that, Scott?
So I actually met Scott Ritter in Baghdad in 2002 or maybe early 2003 when he gave a speech to the Iraqi parliament. And I found him to be a very brave and credible individual at the time, because there was only a couple of Western reporters there, but he got up and they wanted to pose him in front of a portrait of Saddam Hussein, and he told them to take it down. He wasn't going to be used as a prop. And they did eventually, but I mean, for the Iraqi officials in those days to have to take down a picture of Saddam Hussein wasn't an easy choice. So Ritter's got a lot of credibility in my books. There's no denying that the Russian forces did not expect this much of a fight. They got those columns that got wiped out in the early days when they got pushed back in front of Kiev in disarray. The fact that their logistics weren't set up for it, and people have analyzed that as well. And it's that the Russian military was never really meant to fight outside of its own soil, in terms of their logistics being based on the trains and the gauges of the tracks being different from outside of Russia, et cetera. But even Ukraine would have been part of the Soviet Union. So they didn't get very far. But this idea that they were, in this monster of a military in the beginning that was going to just pour all over Europe if we didn't stop them, turned out to be untrue. And if they have learned their lessons and they're bringing in these conscripts and they've got the what's the Wagner group, the mercenaries. Again, we demonize Putin for using a mercenary force to fight his battles for him. Blackwater was all over Iraq, committing all kinds of atrocities for years and years. I saw it myself when I was there. In one case, I had always thought it was American soldiers. It was in Najaf. I got called in by the Iraqis and they wanted me to go see this. And they said that the Americans had emptied the hospital of people and made it into a firing position. And true enough, that had happened. But it turned out when I read the book about Blackwater, it wasn't the American soldiers, it was Blackwater that had done that. Now, you can just imagine the consequences of emptying a hospital, an operating hospital, just overnight and just putting people on the streets. So, yeah, I mean, the things that we accuse Putin of, mostly our American allies have done exactly the same thing at different times.
Francisco, I believe.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Okay, I just had a quick question. I mean, it's fascinating to hear your insight, Mr. Taylor, on Ukraine. But I had a question regarding Canadian naval procurement. And it seems as if there is a large amount of naval procurement that's about to happen with the Type 26 frigates. And I have heard sort of just generally whispers of new Canadian submarines replacing the Victoria class. And I was wondering if you might have any insight into whether or not that's possible even. I mean, the RCN has problems staffing the ships that they have currently, and they are talking about 10 plus new submarines. I wonder if you might have a little bit of insight into naval procurement in the next few years for Canada. Thank you.
I mean, I know that we're committed to the Type 26. I mean, that thing is such a white elephant right now. We're looking at over $100 billion to build 15 ships. That's an astronomical amount of money to build what are essentially 5,000 or 6,000 ton frigates. People are getting entire aircraft carriers built for $3 billion right now. So it just makes absolutely no sense how the country's going to ever do it. They're chronically short of manpower now for the ships that we do have. One of the vessels that we've invested in, and they are building them and they're turning them out now, is the Arctic Offshore Patrol ships, the AOPS, which where they're going to find crews for those, I don't know. I mean, even if you do join the Navy, quote, to see the world, if you go on board a frigate, there's a good chance you're going to get a 6-month NATO tour. You're going to see all the ports of call in Europe and elsewhere. If you get on a ship and tour up in the Arctic for months at a time, that's going to be a pretty abysmal lifestyle for a young sailor. And the same thing goes with putting people. They're looking at 10 to 12 nuclear submarines. Good luck with that. I don't think we have all of our submarines now. The 4 that we have, I don't think they're fully crewed, and they're always having the teething troubles to this day. But to get 10 to 12, it sounds great as a strategic asset, but actually being able to man them and to patrol at length, being the thing with a nuclear submarine is the only thing that forces it to surface at some point is when it runs out of food for the humans on board. So it's the human element, whereas these electric boats that we have now have to surface in order to recharge the batteries. So it's a different lifestyle altogether. And if they get up under the ice cap as they want them to, we're going to have problems with our Americans in the South. And that's something which the 87 white paper was to do exactly that. That was during the Cold War. Canada wanted to buy 12 nuclear submarines. Americans wouldn't even bid on selling them to us. And it was in the end, the Americans that shut down the French and the British bids and shut the whole program down. The Americans don't want Canada possessing under ice capability in the Arctic. So we'll see what happens. But I know Admiral Topshee, I've heard him speak. I've known him for years. And I know that he's set on these goals, but I just don't see them coming to fruition, particularly now with the chronic manpower shortage that they've got all across the board.
Okay, the last question is John Darling. John, can you unmute yourself, please? You're still muted.
I okay now? Yep.
Yes.
Sure.
I don't know what happened there. So thank you, Eve, for a very good session, and Scott, fantastic. I think that we have to keep things in mind when you have the question of the eastern provinces and the attacks against the Russophobes there, not phobes, but Russophones, the people of Russian people. That was an element, but I think that was a provocation. That was the topping on the provocation of the NATO. The shipping in of NATO supplies and making the Ukraine a de facto NATO country. And of course, this meant that it was essentially abolishing any kind of effective defense on the part of Moscow and Russia. So, and here you have all of Europe with what, 15 NATO bases. So that's the overwhelming, obvious element, I think, in the war. Now, just one other thing, and that is, I'd like to congratulate you on your posting here. If Lula can call for peace in Ukraine, why not Canada's left? Very, very interesting. And maybe you would like to just make a few more remarks about it. And I think we should all read it quite closely.
Well, first of all, okay, well, so I think I just did a piece that basically contrasted Lula, Brazilian president's position versus the Canadian left, and how most of the Canadian left would consider Lula's position like way outside of bounds, even though Lula is arguably the best known leftist in the world. You can check that out on my website, and Canadian Dimension also published a version. Scott, did you want to take the NATO element, or?
Well, I mean, I think we all know why Canada's taking the position that it does. I mean, Chrystia Freeland is a firm, advocate for all things Ukraine, and people just, that's become the running narrative. I mean, if Canada pretends that it's a peace-loving country, and then we want to just completely put the blinkers on as far as what these things could be, what are the root causes of it. And the minute you talk about Russophones on the Donbass and the Crimea being 75% ethnic Russian, only I think 5% ethnic Ukrainian, but to say they're going to take it back, I mean, how far back are we going? Even when you put it to Canadians and you say, well, we fought in the Crimea War, we didn't fight against the Ukrainians, we fought against the Russians. Like our own Anglo histories, we know that to be the case. It was given to Ukraine in 1956. Like all these things about drawing lines on a map, like if we just stop using the absolute rhetoric that we've been seeing, in particular in the part of Trudeau about 80 years of peace, it's never been the case. We've changed lines on maps in Europe. NATO has, but surely others can do it if that's what needs to be done. But we should be the ones advocating. We've lost that position now, unfortunately, because of the hard stance that we've taken. And we've now got the Kiev government calling Canadian journalists undesirable, which should be an affront to our politicians who are dealing with these guys, to say, look, that's nonsense. But nobody stepped up. And that's just because they secretly gloated about it because they want to see Pugliese take a knock. But they know it's bullshit. They know he's a good reporter, and they know what he's saying is true. They couldn't attack his message, so they just simply declared him undesirable. And we think we know exactly who that Canadian official is, who's not got any position and hasn't been relevant in the Canadian Diplomatic Corps for about 15 years. So anyway, we'll work on that.
So thanks a lot, Scott, for joining us. This was a very illuminating discussion, and thanks everyone for tuning in. Same place, same time next week. Have a good evening, everyone. Take care.
Could I just ask, Eve, where we can find Scott's pieces? I'm sorry, I'm living outside of Canada now. Where are you publishing your pieces on Ukraine?
So Saltwire picks it up every Tuesday. It's my column. I have a syndicated column in Saltwire, which is the Halifax Chronicle Herald and Cape Breton Post. That's all the Down East papers. And then it's in the Hill Times on Wednesday.
Okay, thank
So
you.
and we put it up on Esprit de Corps, which is my magazine's website as well.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hey, everyone. Good night. Thanks, Scott.